Oh, good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk to you today about a certain piece of history, which I think has some echoes in the current day, which you might find interesting to think about. To begin with, there's an important piece of physics that I need you to understand. So I want you to consider a hose pipe with a close-fitting P. And then if you blow at one end, you'll not be surprised if the P travels away from you. And if you were to suck, you wouldn't be surprised if the P would come toward you. Now think of the P as a piston, if you will. That's the physics. Just keep it at the back of your minds. In about 1827 appeared what turned out to be a very influential document by a man called George Medhurst, who actually died that year, a new system of inland conveyance for goods and passengers. And what George was interested in doing was using the principle of the hose pipe and the P to move people around. Well, of course, if you put the people inside the P, conceptually inside the piston, this may work, but you're going to need a very, very big pipe, and you're going to need a lot of power to create the blow or the suck. Alternatively, you might have a much smaller and much more manageable hose pipe with a piston within it, which you can push or pull as you please, which is somehow connected to the passengers who are exterior to the pipe. And therein lies the problem. How are you going to make this connection in such a way that the vacuum or the pressure is maintained? You have to understand what things were like in the first half of that century. Steam locomotion was a reality, had become a reality in the first 2 decades or so of that century, and by 1820 was a reality. It was nevertheless very underdeveloped and didn't work terrifically well. By 1830, things had really begun to take off, and there was a massive demand, in the first instance industrially, but increasingly for passenger traffic. And then by 1840, another 10 years on, this was the period of what became called railway mania. Anybody with a farthing could invest it in the railways and expect to get a good return, and they did. Predictably, this was followed by an economic collapse, 1846-47, and the wheels really fell off the bus, to use a poor metaphor. So Medhurst's ideas being developed in the 1830s were coming just about at the right time. What these people were looking for was a step change in the efficiency and delivery of rail locomotion. The traditional locomotives were exceptionally heavy. They couldn't handle gradients. They couldn't handle tight curves. It took them all they were worth to move themselves before they got going with the payload. And this is an easy problem to understand. If you keep the power stationary and somehow transmit it to the vehicle, perhaps that will be more efficient. And there was nothing new in this idea. The water wheels are pretty stationary things. They revolve on an axis, but it's possible to transmit the power that they produce through all sorts of axles and belts. So not a stupid idea at all. And as railway mania grew, there was growing interest in the idea of using this atmospheric propulsion, sucking things with a vacuum to move carriages sitting outside the tube. And the solution to this problem that gained the most traction was one due to Samuel Clegg, who produced a patent in 1839, railway mania about to take off. Here it was, a new improvement in valves and the combination of them with machinery. And Clegg was heavily involved with some serious marine engineers, the Samuda brothers. He then actually moved on to do different things, and the Samudas picked this patent up and really pushed. Here's a picture of Joseph Samuda. This is 1873. As you can see, by then, he'd become very wealthy and very influential, a very successful man indeed. And here is the best picture I've got of his brother Jacob, who most unfortunately died in an explosion at the launching of the Gypsy Queen off the Isle of Dogs. Nevertheless, he was around 6 years before that. Here's the idea. What you're doing here is looking at a cross-section of a pipe. It's a metal pipe, and there is a slot cut down the top, so it's not a perfect cylinder. That slot is covered by a very long strip of leather, which can rise at one side. There's a metal strip to hold it in place, and then there's a lot of tallow and beeswax, which creates or is intended to create an airtight seal. Here you see there is the pipe at the bottom, extending to left and to right. Within it is a close-fitting piston. This is the P, if you like. And that piston is connected to some machinery which goes through the valve, the leather valve, to the vehicle which sits atop. And a vacuum at the blue end will suck the piston, and via the rod will cause the vehicle to move. And that was the substance of Clegg's patent, which the Samudas picked up. They built a small demo system and invited interested parties to come and have a look, and they did. You probably recognise this chap immediately. Isambard Brunel was there. This is an iconic picture of him in 1857. Here's another chap you might have heard of, one of the very famous Stevenson family. Again, the picture taken some years later. And there followed a very public and very bitter debate about this technology. Brunel was in the forefront of those championing it, and Stevenson was foremost amongst those rubbishing it. And there was a very public row. With the backdrop of this huge demand for efficient locomotion, in the end, 4 lines were built which used the Clegg-Samuda system. A short one in Ireland, a rather longer and very useful demonstration one in South London, the South Devon line, which many people have heard of, I'm sure, and a short one in Paris. This was the one which I think became best known. It ran from Exeter at the top all the way down to Newton Abbot and ran down the side of the Exe estuary, which was the broad gauge line which Brunel had already engineered, so he didn't have to create the trackway for this. A distance of some 20 miles, he used 8 stationary steam engines to create the vacuum which would suck trains along. It would work in both directions, so when a train had passed from north to south, the engines could then work and suck from south to north, and was extraordinarily ambitious. It was the absolute pinnacle of this idea of atmospheric propulsion. And Brunel had, oh God almighty, he had expansion plans. These railways were going to be everywhere. That was the idea. As you can see, it didn't actually run for 12 months. Brunel knew when he was beaten, and he was beaten by underpowered engines. They just weren't good enough. Valve problems, maintaining the airtight seal proved much harder than anticipated, and all sorts of issues surrounding interoperability. So traditional steam locomotives were delivering passengers and goods at one end, and they all had to be transshipped in order to go down the atmospheric stretch, and then transshipped again at the far end, and this was not really the way to go. There are various remains of this that can still be seen. This is the fairly well-known Devon red sandstone pumping station at Starcross on the Exe estuary, which now houses an atmospheric railway museum. Here is a short stretch of pipe at the Didcot GWR Museum. This gives you a good idea, I think, of the gauge of pipe that Brunel was using. You can see the slot along the top, and you can perhaps imagine a vacuum being developed inside this thing and the piston being sucked along it. All sorts of problems are solved by Brunel, largely satisfactorily. If you've got multiple engine houses, A, B, C, D, E, if you consider, let's say, engine house C, it has to suck air out of the pipe between itself and its neighbours. So the distance between these pumping stations is a very important parameter. If it's a large distance, you're going to save money because you're building fewer engines. If it's a small distance, the railway is going to move more efficiently because it's easier to extract the vacuum. Brunel did all this design before the things were built, so he was taking a bit of a shot in the dark. The engine houses were powered by the world's biggest steam engines. Brunel was really not short of ambition. He ordered the biggest engines that could possibly be provided. And these were powering air pumps, which were the world's most powerful. Large, expensive machinery, expensive to run. And so they were only driven hard when a train was actually coming. So it was important for the engine houses to communicate with each other very efficiently in order that the engines were only working hard for the minimum length of time. Luckily, telegraph had been developed and was working, but it's another instance of groundbreaking technology being installed as a necessity. Well, it turned out that what they had thought was a good idea didn't actually work. They were beaten by the materials that were available to them at the time. And by the time they realized this, Brunel's correspondence with the GWR board can be read to this day. Railway mania was over, the economic slump had arrived, and the whole idea, as envisaged by Clegg, Samuda and Brunel, was lost. There were one or two special purpose applications that survived. So here, for example, was a sort of novelty system at Crystal Palace. What you see here is a vehicle inside which people would ride, and it fitted snugly inside the tunnel, which you can see. And then a very large fan would either extract air from the tunnel or blow air into it. And this thing was sucked and blown. It was only a mile or so long, so it was not in any sense a solution to large-scale transport problems. And those of a certain age will almost certainly remember the idea of pneumatic transmission of money inside department stores from the departments where you would buy your suit or your socks down to the cash office in the basement. And in the cash office in the basement, they would put these capsules back in these pipes and send them back to customers upstairs. And you can see an absolute forest of pneumatic transportation. A good picture. And then there were dark ages that lasted decades, and these ideas were just forgotten. And in due course, there was a new dawn. And perhaps the opening of the new dawn is about 1965. This article appeared in Scientific American. Edwards was theorizing about vehicles. You see the picture at the bottom, you can realize what's going on here. Passengers will sit inside these capsules and be sucked along a pipe. And his idea was to connect, let's say, Boston and Washington for a 90-minute journey. And he was anticipating that the technology he was describing, only theoretically, could easily manage speeds of 500 miles per hour or more. Those of you who've been to Brazil might possibly have visited Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre has an airport with two terminals, which are connected, as is common, by a very short railway. This one is actually atmospheric propulsion. It's not clear from the picture, but there is, driving this thing, a tube and a piston within the tube which drags the vehicle, and it's using exactly the Clegg-Samuda principle. Of course, the materials they're using are a great deal better than beeswax, tallow and leather. Give it another few years and this very recognizable chap appears, and Elon Musk was talking about 10 years ago now about his Hyperloop. And here's a picture. Again, you will recognize what's going on. There's a vehicle inside a tube which is evacuated. The technology really has moved on because he's talking about air bearings and linear induction motors and axial compressors. But Musk is thinking about 10 years ago connecting LA and San Francisco with vehicles traveling at 1,200 kilometers per hour. Think about it. Musk has actually touched a nerve because a lot of people have picked this idea and treated it very seriously. So you will find around the globe many organizations talking about Hyperloops, which are adaptations of what you saw on the preceding slide. And demonstration systems are actually beginning to emerge. And major installations talking about moving people around at or near Mach 1. Here's the BBC page from November just last year, only 13 months ago. And this was the first serious public demo of the Virgin Hyperloop. Here is a picture of the tube that they were using. You can see things have come a long way from the South Devon atmospheric railway line. And what I want you to think about is that Brunel and Musk, or their organizations, were facing, in some ways, similar problems. There was a demand for a step change in the efficiency and speed of public transport. They face serious financial obstacles, obviously. They face very serious technical obstacles. Engineering has to be groundbreaking, and that's before you begin to consider the health and safety issues and the very popular skepticism that surrounds what they're trying to do. So maybe that's my next TED talk, actually do a compare and contrast on these two guys and what are their relative chances of success. So here's the timeline. George Medhurst, about 1830. There's a prehistory, actually, which is due to Denis Papin in the 1600s, who was the first to talk about using pressure and vacuum to get things done. Railway mania, a short period, the 4 established atmospheric railway lines, and then the dark ages culminating in Elon Musk about 10 years ago, and you are here, and there's a rosy future ahead of us. Thank you for listening.